Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Michael Scheuer!
Thank you, Mike. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really honored to be here. I had my hair done, but the rain plays hell with it. I'm sorry. I thought I'd talk about what I consider at least one of Dr. Paul's most important contributions to the current American political scene, and that's the policy of non-intervention. I think the rally here today is yet more evidence that increasing numbers of Americans stand with Dr. Paul, not only on domestic issues, but on the subject of foreign policy. And on this latter issue, Dr. Paul stands where we should all stand. That is foursquare with the Founding Fathers. And the bitter disputes that occurred among and between the delegates to our Constitutional Convention in 1787, and in the just as bitter debates that raged between Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the ratification campaign that followed it, one of the few ideas on which both sides agreed was that the new nation's foreign policy ought to be one of neutrality and non-intervention. So broadly held was this conviction that contemporary Americans often forget that the clarion warning against the danger of intervention and entangling alliances came not from the Federalist George Washington, but from the Republican Thomas Jefferson. As we gather here today, America is again being guided by a broad foreign policy consensus that is deeply entrenched in both major political parties, the academy, the media, and among Christian evangelical leaders. Sadly, today's operative foreign policy consensus is not the wise neutrality and non-intervention of the founders and of Dr. Paul, but rather an expansionist, quasi-racist, bankrupting, and war-fomenting interventionism that has in the last 40 years slowly, but now more rapidly, helped to bring the United States both to the brink of bankruptcy and to the threshold of an endless war with the Muslim world. Our evolving economic catastrophe needs little comment from me, especially given the Obama administration's decision this week to pour tens of billions of more US dollars into the IMF to waste on that walking corpse known as the European Union. As we teeter on the edge of this economic precipice, however, we ought to immediately stop entertaining the delusion that we will be able to cut the budget of the Defense Department either substantially or for a prolonged period of years. Significantly lower defense spending is a chimera that will disappear quickly as we, in the next few years, move further into an endless war at home and abroad with the Muslim world. It should be obvious to all that defense spending cannot be cut if U.S. political leaders continue to intervene in the affairs of other peoples and other nations. And we are moving into an intensifying war with Islam because, as Dr. Paul has repeatedly said, our bipartisan governing elite, supported by most of the media, the academy, and American citizen-dominated lobbies that represent Israeli and Saudi interests, resolutely refuse to accept the hard but really obvious fact that the U.S. government's interventionist foreign policies in the Muslim world are what motivate the Islamist groups and the increasing numbers of Muslims eager to wage war against the United States. Indeed, in the decade plus since 9/11, Washington, under both parties, has waged an interventionist campaign in the Muslim world that has made sure that the next generation of young Muslims will support those who are already waging war on America. Now, this fact does not mean that we caused the religious war in which we are involved. Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda began to attack the United States overseas in 1992, declared war on us in 1996 and 1998, and finally brought war to America's shores in September 2001. Al-Qaeda and its allies started this war. Of that, there can be no doubt. But our enemies deserve neither sympathy nor empathy. But Americans, all of us, deserve the truth from their leaders if the Republic is to be defended. And there can be no doubt what the factors the Islamists are motivated by. Since the mid-1990s, the leaders of our enemies have published an enormous body of written work and oral statements that has explained their motivation in precise detail. In none of this material have the Islamists described their motivation as being based on hatred for America's liberties, freedoms, elections, gender equality, R-rated movies, or beer. They likewise have not spoken of waging war on Americans because of the way they think or interact or live here in North America. The Islamist description of their motivation has nothing whatever to do with what General Colin Powell once called a Muslim war on Western civilization. But rather, they are motivated by an intense belief that they are facing a US-led Western war meant to destroy Islam and to kill Muslims. For the Islamists, the cause of this war is to be found in the West's interventionist foreign policies, its unqualified support for Israel, its military and diplomatic protection of the Saudi police state, and in the presence of US and Western military forces in Iraq, Afghanistan, Muslim countries in Africa, and on the Arabian Peninsula. In other words, we are at war because of what the United States government does, not because of how Americans think and live at home. US and Western intervention has motivated those who are waging war against us. And until US foreign policy is formulated based on the recognition of this fact, enormous amounts of American blood and treasure will continue to be expended in a war we will eventually lose. Only US, Western, and Israeli leaders claim that the Islamists are waging a war on our civilization. And this claim is a palpable and a lethal lie. A lie whose continued propagation by President Obama, Secretary Clinton, Senators Graham, Lieberman, McCain, many NATO leaders, is pushing the United States into an ever harsher and more geographically dispersed war with the Muslim world. One need only compare a map of the world in 2001 with one from today to see the substantial growth in Islamist power and the consequent erosion of America's strategic position over the past decade. In short, it is our supposedly well-educated political leaders, not the Islamists, who are the main engines of driving the world toward what Professor Huntington once called a clash of civilizations. This clash, in other words, is being fomented by those educated in the Ivy League, rather than by the graduates of the Islamic universities of Cairo and Medina. And why is this the case? Well, first, the US bipartisan governing elite, many of whose members, as I noted, have gone to our most prestigious universities, is an arrogant and intellectually isolated group who, despite chanting endlessly about the glories of multiculturalism and diversity, know nothing about American culture or history, and even less about foreign peoples and cultures. They know the world that exists in their own minds, and the world they want to build and force others to participate in, but they know nothing about the world as it exists. Today, therefore, we see President Obama and his fellow Western leaders working to impose their idea of perfection, secular democracy, on Muslim populations ready to fight that intervention, perhaps to their death, but certainly to ours. Second, our political leaders in both parties are owned by a series of lobbies representing foreign powers, that want no change in US policies in the Muslim world. The Israeli lobby, in the form of AIPAC and other groups dominated by pro-Israel US citizens, has corrupted the US political system to the point where only unqualified support for anything Israel wants to do, even if it is counter to our genuine national interests, merits the protection of the First Amendment. The claim that Israel is an expensive, bloody, and potentially fatal burden on the conduct of US foreign policy and national security affairs is a simple, obvious, and irrefutable fact. But if anyone makes such a simple statement of fact, he is labeled an anti-Semite, an isolationist, or an American hater, or any one of a large number of other slanders. The Israeli lobby's flagship publication, Commentary, you will remember, accused Dr. Paul of being anti-Israel and anti-American when he stated the simple fact that our Islamist enemies are motivated by U.S. foreign policy. The bottom line is, there will be no end to the growth of our war with Islam as long as U.S. policy toward Israel remains what it is today, and U.S. political leaders are so afraid of Israel's U.S. citizen-dominated lobby that they prefer dead U.S. Marines to disrupting the flow of campaign contributions from pro-Israel U.S. citizens. They also seem these days to prefer an unnecessary and surely disastrous war with Iran, rather than to risk access to their pro-Israeli paymasters. These same political leaders are also in the thrall of the Saudi lobby, which is quieter but just as pernicious as Israel's. Saudi officials make no effort to hide the fact that they reward U.S. political leaders, military, diplomatic, and intelligence officers, and senior civil servants once they are retired if they had been quote-unquote friends of Saudi Arabia during their careers. Need proof? Just check the op-ed pages of the Wall Street Journal after the next time the Saudis do something directly counter to U.S. interests, and you will find pieces defending Riyadh's action written by former State Department officials and former U.S. ambassadors to Saudi Arabia. The Saudi lobby's power is, needless to say, augmented by the Saudi regime's relationship with U.S. energy companies and U.S. arms makers, both of which seem more interested in keeping their seats on the Saudi gravy train than on working for the interests of the United States. Beyond our political leaders' ideological commitment to constant intervention abroad and their blatantly corrupt ties to multiple foreign lobbies, it is worth taking a look at what Tom Paine might have described as our leaders' astonishing and chronic lack of plain common sense in the conduct of U.S. foreign policy. On this last point, I would close by referring to Senator Charles Grassley's recent comments that for being a Harvard graduate and a professor of law, President Obama appears to be a pretty stupid individual. Leaving aside whether such a precise term should be used in describing Obama or any president, Senator Grassley perhaps inadvertently points to our nation's educational disaster, which itself is a powerful factor in making the world unsafe for America, and which, I believe, produces people who are indeed quite stupid in terms of knowing our history, the history of other nations, and knowing how the world works and has always worked. Let's take a look, just for a moment, at what I think is a genuine and irrefutably stupid foreign policy decision that emanated from and was designed by leaders in both political parties, again, mostly graduates from the Ivy League. The decision dealt with Sudan, hardly a country of significant strategic importance to the United States, but one in which John McCain, Hillary Clinton, and Susan Rice are determined to make good pagans out of devout Muslims. Slavishly following the incisive foreign policy brilliance of George Clooney, the much-honored sage of Rodeo Drive and this generation's Kissinger, Bush and Obama, our major NATO allies, and the always war-causing non-governmental organizations in the UN began an interventionist process which ended in Western powers forcing the division of oil-rich Sudan into two separate nations, now named Sudan and South Sudan. In the last few weeks, we have seen a renewal of major combat between the two states as Sudan begins a perfectly predictable and Muslim world-supported effort to regain the territory and the natural resources the West stole from them. Now, man is, of course, unfortunately hardwired for war. And wars are far more common than long periods of peace. So perhaps the renewed violence in the Sudan is just one more of a long and sorry history of such events. But before chalking up this particular fight simply to man's warlike nature, let us look at the actions taken in regard to Sudan by Clooney and his cocaine-addled Hollywood colleagues, by Bush and Obama, Lindsey Graham and John McCain, Joe Lieberman and Hillary Clinton, and by the prime ministers of France and Britain and the leaders of the UN. The decision to permanently divide Sudan was in essence a decision by the US-led West, first, to take a long-established Muslim-majority nation, intervene in its national internal affairs, and dividing it, creating two sovereign states where only one had existed. Second, to take the newly fashioned state, cleverly called South Sudan, and give it to a Christian population that had long and violently fought the UN-recognized Muslim-majority government in Khartoum. Third, to give the new state of South Sudan more than 70% of Sudan's oil reserves and support the construction of new pipelines through Kenya for the export of that oil, which will replace the pipelines that now move the oil through Sudan for export. These actions removed from Khartoum's control Sudan's only major source of income, and once the new pipelines are completed, will likewise deny the Sudanese the monies they would have earned from the transit of oil through their country. Fourth, the West intervened to draw a boundary between the two states that not only denied the Sudanese their major source of revenue, but which divided, as the British were specialized in the 19th century, into the territories of rival religious, ethnic, and tribal groups, which have long conducted their economic and agricultural activities in a region where borders were tribal and flexible and porous, and not political and fixed. To measure our leaders' stupidity, or more politely, their limited level of common sense, we might ask whether in an era when America's Islamist enemies are motivated by their belief that Washington, its allies, and the UN, A, intervene in the Muslim world whenever and for whatever reasons they see fit, B, conduct a foreign policy that is designed to destroy Islam, C, regard Muslim lives as cheap and less valuable than the lives of Westerners, Christians, and Jews, and D, to seek to attain full control of the Muslim world's oil reserves, it was really wise to rip a large part of Muslim Sudan's territory away and give it to an avowedly Christian government. In this context, it may well be that Senator Grassley's term stupid is exactly the correct adjective to apply to all the individuals from both parties, the media, the academy, and the military, who are engaged in making such detrimental and war-causing policies towards Sudan and the Islamic world as a whole. In closing, let me say that Americans, in my view, and I include myself here, too often forget that no nation on earth has ever had a right to exist. All nations, America, Peru, Malaysia, Uganda, or any other you choose to mention, will exist only as long as they have viable economies, political societies marked by a measure of cohesion and amity, and a government that avoids excessive intervention in domestic and economic affairs, as well as the affairs of foreign peoples. We are, I think you will agree, in deep trouble on each of these points, which is why Dr. Paul's ideas and candidacy have struck such a resonant chord among non-elite Americans. Those people who worked for a living, raised children, never went to Harvard or Yale, and approached their lives and their world with decency and common sense and not arcane theories. For America, Dr. Paul's advocacy of a non-interventionist foreign policy represents a step away from the precipice of economic, social, and military ruin. As the founders knew, and as Dr. Paul reminds all of us, unnecessary offensive wars involve us in foreign problems we do not understand and which are often intractable, problems that bleed our country financially and in the lives of our soldier children, and in wars that inevitably lead, as we have seen in the past decade, to the contraction of domestic liberty. For this reason, I am most pleased to have been able to speak to you today, and I am even more pleased to offer my minimal support, I guess is what I have, and prayers to Dr. Paul and his campaign for a foreign policy driven only by common sense and the genuine national interests of all of the American people. Thank you.